Today's story is about a plane crash that happened in 1972. But here's the thing, the crash itself, as horrific as it was, turned out to be just the beginning. Because in the months that followed, flight crews across the Eastern Airlines started reporting something impossible. But before we dive in, if you love the stories about the unexplained, the forgotten and the twisted, you're in the right place. Every week we release 1 to 2 full-length episodes, plus 3 to 5 shorts that dig into even deeper corners of history. So go ahead and shake hands with the like button, hit subscribe, and turn on all notifications to stay in tune with our weekly drops, because your support means everything to us as we get better and grow this new channel. Alright, here we go. On December 29, 1972, about 150 passengers line up at gate 26 of JFK International Airport in New York, waiting to board their flight to Miami, Florida. This was an exciting time to fly, because the massive wide-body jetliners we take for granted today were brand new technology. And the plane these passengers were about to board was considered the best airliner in the world. It was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, only a few months old, a true marvel of engineering. The TriStar was enormous, outfitted to seat up to 400 passengers, powered by 3 massive Rolls-Royce engines, one under each wing and the third one center-mounted in the rear fuselage. It has state-of-the-art systems, including an advanced autopilot with an auto-land feature that could literally fly and land the plane by itself. It even had a galley, a small kitchen built into the lower part of the aircraft, connected to the main cabin by 2 small elevators. But what excited passengers the most wasn't just the impressive design, it was the service. Eastern Airlines were known for top-notch treatment regardless of what class ticket you bought. Shortly before boarding began, the cabin crew of 13 members arrived. At the head of the crew was Captain Robert "Bob" Loft. He was 55 years old, a very experienced pilot with just under 30,000 hours of flying time. The only thing he didn't have much experience with was this particular type of aircraft, but that was only because TriStar was so new. He had logged just under 280 hours on the L-1011, which was not a lot. Flying alongside him was First Officer Albert Stockstill, 39 years old, with 5,800 total flight hours and 306 hours on the TriStar, which actually made him slightly more experienced than Captain Loft on this particular aircraft. Additionally, flying with them was their flight engineer, Donald Repo, who had 15,700 hours total experience and 53 hours on the type. After completing their pre-flight checks and reviewing the weather in Miami, which was perfect with great visibility and almost no clouds, the pilots made a decision that First Officer Stockstill would be the pilot flying tonight and the captain would be the pilot monitoring, which was totally standard procedure and still exercised in the cockpits every day today. Around 9:20 p.m., Captain Loft's voice came over the intercom with that professional warmth that made passengers feel safe. Seconds later, the runway lights blurred into the river of dots and then the plane lifted off. The city fell away beneath them and the darkness swallowed them whole as the engines settled into a clean, soft rumble. Everything was perfect. The flight was completely routine. Passengers flipped through the magazines, dozed on the blankets, sipped coffee served by friendly attendants. Up in the cockpit, everything glowed green and steady. The TriStar was marketed as fail-safe, and that night it seemed to be living up to that promise. At 11:32 p.m., Miami's lights appeared on the horizon and the crew began preparing for landing. This involved a whole series of actions to configure the aircraft properly. When the plane leveled off for the approach, First Officer Stockstill called out, "Gear down." Captain Loft reached out and pulled the landing gear lever, and immediately realized they might have an issue. In modern airliners, each set of landing gear has an indicator light in the cockpit that tells pilots when the gear is fully extended and locked in place. The TriStar had 3 sets of gear, one under each wing and one in the nose of the aircraft right under the cockpit. When everything was working correctly, pulling that lever down should light up 3 green lights. Captain Loft only saw 2 green lights. The nose gear stayed extinguished. While this was not ideal, it was not a reason for a concern just yet. On a brand new airliner, a burned out light bulb was way more likely than an actual landing gear malfunction. So Captain Loft recycled the gear, which means he flipped it back up and then back down again. The nose light still refused to illuminate. At 11:34 p.m., Captain Loft radioed Miami approach and told them Flight 401 would need to divert away from the airport to work on the minor issue. Miami turned west to hold over the Everglades, a natural region of flooded grasslands in the southern portion of the state of Florida. Because it is essentially a swampland, there are no lights illuminating it. So Flight 401 was circling around a complete area of darkness with no visual cues of any kind. So nothing to give them any sense of how low they were. In that kind of darkness, the instruments were the only way to know which way it was down, which way was up. At 11:36 p.m., Captain Loft set the autopilot to maintain 2,000 feet at 200 knots. And for the next several minutes, both pilots focused entirely on one dark indicator light. Captain Loft twisted it around. First Officer Stockstill tried to flip it and put it back the other way. Flight Engineer Repo checked the circuits. The light continued to stay dark. On the Flight Engineer's panel, he could see that the numbers looked normal. Hydraulic pressure was exactly where it should be. The gear position logic showed everything was fine, and based on the system indicators, it appeared like the landing gear had done exactly what it was supposed to do. The stubborn lights simply would not admit it. Finally, Captain Loft turned to Flight Engineer Repo and asked him to go down to the hellhole and try to visually confirm that the nose gear was down. The hellhole was an electronics bay, cramped space beneath the cockpit floor with a small forward-facing window that let you peek into the nose gear bay and see if the gear is actually down or not. So Flight Engineer unbuckled his seatbelt, slid open the access hatch and descended with his flashlight. And now, all 3 crew members were heavily focused on this one little light bulb they believed was burned out. And nobody was monitoring the aircraft flight path, because they believed that the autopilot had it all under control. But based on the flight data recorder, something happened around this time that none of the pilots noticed. While discussing the light bulb issue and turning around in his seat, Captain Loft accidentally bumped his control column. This action shifted the autopilot from altitude hold mode, which kept the plane at a steady 2,000 feet, into control wheel steering mode, which required pilot input to maintain altitude. But here's a critical thing. The autopilot didn't fully disengage, which would trigger a fairly loud audible warning. It simply switched its mode. So there was no warning alarm and no audio alert that would have told the pilots something had changed. And since all 3 pilots were completely absorbed in dealing with the light bulb, nobody noticed the slight change in the aircraft pitch or altitude. The TriStar began to slowly descend, almost imperceptibly. Down in the hellhole, Flight Engineer Repo shined his flashlight through the small window, but all he could see was complete darkness. He could not confirm whether the nose gear was down or not. At around the same time, a chime sounded in the cockpit, an alert indicating the aircraft had deviated from its assigned altitude. But in a twisted stroke of bad luck, the speaker that played the warning was located directly above the flight engineer station, and the flight engineer was currently in the hellhole staring into darkness, so nobody heard that warning. The altimeter in front of Captain Loft swept through 1,000 feet, then 900, then 800. Inside the passenger cabin, nothing felt different. Passengers had no idea they were descending. They thought they were still circling safely at 2,000 feet, waiting for the pilots to sort out whatever minor issue was keeping them from landing. At around 600 feet, it appears the pilots finally realized their mistake, and First Officer is heard saying, we still at 2,000, right? To which Captain Loft heard responding, "Hey, what's happening here?" Those were the last words, followed by sound of impact, after which everything went silent. The Everglades rose up to meet them in complete darkness. At 11:42 p.m., Eastern Airlines Flight 401 slammed into the swampland at over 200 miles per hour. Fuel flashed orange and went out almost immediately under a skin of water and mud. The plane hit the Everglades at the left bank, shattering immediately and scattering parts across the wide area. For a moment there was only silence. The crash instantly killed 101 passengers and crew, but miraculously 75 people survived the impact. Not too far away, two men in an airboat were frog fishing, and they saw that brief orange glow bloom and vanish immediately. They turned on their fan and headed towards the place where the sky had just swallowed something whole. They arrived to find wreckage scattered across the swamp in a way that barely resembled an airplane. The Everglades didn't pile debris up. It laid everything out in a field of small, shining pieces. The air smelled like electricity and burning fuel. When two men killed the airboat's engine, the swamp seemed to listen. Then they heard the cries, coming from the left, right, behind them. It seemed to come from every direction. Human cries paired with the sound of the swamp nightlife. Alligators, snakes, birds, a true cacophony of tragedy. The two men jumped down from their boat and began helping those they could see and those who were still alive. By dawn, Coast Guard helicopters were lifting survivors out of the grass in baskets and slings. Captain Loft and First Officer Stockstill were killed in a crash, while Flight Engineer Repo survived the initial impact but died later in the hospital. The NTSB investigation revealed what the evidence couldn't hide. The NTSB is a National Transportation Safety Board, and it's a US agency responsible for conducting investigations in major accidents like this. The nose gear had been down and locked the entire time. The burnt out indicator light had become a point of total fixation, and an accidental bump had shifted the autopilot just enough. In a place where the night had no edges and no reference points, three excellent pilots had lost track of the altitude for 4 critical minutes. The cause was ordinary and human, a tiny mistake that cascaded into catastrophe. In the aftermath of the accident, Eastern Airlines retrained their crews and Lockheed revised their procedures. New manuals were written to guard against the danger of small problems that consume all your attention. The Everglades returned to keeping its secrets, and that should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. It was only the beginning. The following part of the story has been told and retold by numerous sources, online investigators and YouTubers, and a lot of them fictionalize the majority of the truth in order to gain notoriety. However, here at Scriptum Tales, we promise you to draw a clear line between verifiable reality, even if it's unbelievable, and fiction. So what I'm going to tell you now is a series of reports that follow the crash of Flight 401. And I'll leave it for you to judge the truth from fiction. So first, I'm going to tell you a few of the most popular paranormal stories associated with Flight 401 and its crew, and then I will reveal what all those sightings may have in common. A few weeks after the ill-fated flight crashed into the Everglades, and long before the official crash investigation report was released, a similar L-1011 TriStar sat at the gate in Newark while late passengers hurried down the aisle. The senior flight attendant did a final head count and came up one too high, so she walked through the entire aircraft again, from the back to the front. And when she reached the end of her count, in the first class she found a uniformed Eastern Airlines captain sitting in a window seat, which would generally not be a problem. The airlines routinely allow their pilots and crew to fly in a passenger cabin when they need to transition from one location to another for a new assignment. It's called deadheading crew. Pilots flying as passengers to get to the next assignment, and since they don't have to go through the same ticketing procedures as passengers, the cabin crew may not know they will have a deadhead until the boarding starts. The deadheading crew member, however, is still required to register with the cabin for accountability purposes. So when the flight attendant saw that unknown pilot, she leaned in and asked his name. He didn't react and didn't even turn his head. She repeated herself, slower this time. The man just kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. After a few repeated attempts to speak with the unknown pilot, the flight attendant called the cockpit and asked the captain or the first officer to come down and try to talk to the unresponsive pilot. So a few minutes later, a captain came down and politely crouched down next to the unidentified captain to make eye contact, and the second he did that, he felt his chest drop. because he immediately recognized the face that stared back at him. He knew him personally. He flew with him before, and he knew that this face did not belong in a seat. It belonged to a file record, because he was looking directly into the eyes of Captain Bob Loft, who died a few weeks earlier in the crash of Flight 401. Numerous people, crew members and passengers within 2 or 3 rows, watched as the figure in the seat simply ceased to be. The fabric of the seat cushion sprang back up, the seatbelt hung unbuckled, the space where a man had been sitting was just empty. They searched the entire airplane because people don't simply vanish in front of witnesses. They found no one. As a result of this incident, the flight crew was so shaken up the flight had to be cancelled. The report filed for the cancelled flight mentioned none of the ghostly encounter, but instead listed a technical malfunction. And unofficially, more flight attendants started asking which specific aircraft they were scheduled on before they showed up for work, trying to avoid any assignments on L-1011s. The events of another story occurred in the lower galley of another TriStar. This time, a caterer was loading meal trays on a trolley when he glanced at the stainless steel oven door and froze. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. The flight engineer from the Flight 401, Don Repo's face looked out from the polished steel with the same calm, focused expression he'd carried to work every day. The reflection lifted one hand and pointed towards the starboard engine. The caterer spun around to see where he was pointing, but the galley was empty. When he turned back to the oven, the reflection showed only the galley and his own face with the mouth hanging half open. After he reported what he'd seen, maintenance inspected the starboard engine that afternoon and found a cracked turbine blade, the kind of defect that could cause catastrophic engine failure in mid-flight. On another plane, when a flight crew entered the cockpit before the flight, they saw a uniform crew member just sitting on a jump seat. When asked for his name and employee ID, he said with a blank expression on his face, "There will never be another crash of an L-1011. We'll see to that." And then he simply vanished. Multiple other reports emerged later claiming that the crew members of the doomed aircraft were appearing on other L-1011s, in the galleys, in the cockpit, in the passenger cabin, everywhere. Flight engineer Repo appeared to be the most frequently spotted apparition. He would appear to point out a malfunction or to warn the crew about something being wrong with the airplane. On another occasion, Captain Loft reportedly informed ground crew via the radio that the pre-flight checks were complete, while in reality the actual captain of the plane wasn't even on board yet. After hearing about that event, the real captain canceled the flight altogether. Now here is where we really enter the realm of unconfirmed and sometimes even pure speculation. At some point after the incident, a rumor began to spread that all the ghost sightings on the L-1011s were the result of parts salvaged from the doomed aircraft being installed on airplanes of the same type as replacement. This in general is not an uncommon practice, and parts from damaged or destroyed aircraft can be utilized as spare parts on another aircraft after passing the necessary scrutiny, ensuring that the part itself is not damaged and functioning properly as designed. No confirmed evidence shows that any Flight 401 parts were ever reinstalled on another Eastern Airlines planes. The NTSB crash investigation required recovery and bench testing of functional components, flight instruments, recorders, engines, and so on, but that is routine in any major investigation and does not imply reuse. Aviation authorities agree that parts pulled from a hull submerged in jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and swamp water could never meet airworthiness standards without an exhaustive and costlier overhaul than simply fitting new replacements. In his 1980 book, Robert Serling flatly calls the story of reused Flight 401 components a myth. Frank Borman, at the time CEO of Eastern Airlines and Apollo 8 astronaut by the way, publicly branded the rumors garbage and denied any cannibalization of the wreckage. Today, only 2 sources offer somewhat verifiable accounts of Flight 401. Number 1 is the NTSB aircraft accident report, linked in the description. And another one is John Fuller's book Ghost of Flight 401, where he explores the paranormal side of the tragedy. Neither mentions salvage nor provides evidence it ever occurred. Years went by. Eastern Airlines went out of business. Some employees retired, others passed away, and those once too young to trust the stories grew old enough to share what they truly believe happened. They said they'd seen Captain Loft seated where no living human could sit, or caught Don Repo's reflection glinting in steel that doesn't reflect. Their presence felt like guiding hand on a shoulder or silent watcher. Some crews even called them guardians whenever they were sure management wasn't listening. People argue about this story because that's what stories are for. Psychologists talk about grief and confirmation bias. Engineers talk about how a serial number on a salvage part could become a talisman for superstition. But there remained that cracked turbine blade that the reflection pointed to. There remained the flight where a seatbelt swung empty after a few people watched a man disappear. Maybe the dead simply finished what they'd started, kept doing the job they'd always done, which was watching over strangers. Maybe memory became bright enough to borrow a shape for a moment. Either way, the Everglades kept their silence, the airplanes went back to being only machines, and the next time a warning light refused to illuminate, pilots checked the altimeter first. And if you talk to flight crews who worked for Eastern in those years, some of them will tell you quietly when they're sure nobody's recording, they're grateful those men came back, even if they can't explain how or why. Because in the end, whether you believe in ghosts or not, 75 people walked away from Flight 401. And in the years that followed, how many others were saved by warnings that shouldn't have been possible? That's the question nobody at Eastern Airlines ever answered publicly. Let me know what you think of today's story in the comments below, and if you enjoyed it and want more tales of the unexplained, forgotten and twisted, hit like and subscribe. Your support means everything as we grow this new channel. We've got 3 to 5 shorts dropping every week and brand new deep dive long video every weekend, so there is always something twisted and bizarre waiting for you. And I'll see you in the next one.